And good morning, good afternoon to all those that have taken their time to participate in this event under the auspices of the Brazilian Center for International Relations, CEBRI, an independent, non-partisan, and multidisciplinary think tank guided by excellence, ethics, and transparency in the formulation and dissemination of high-quality content on the international scene and the role played by Brazil in its external relations. My name is José Alfredo Graça Lima. I'm Vice President of CEBRI's Curator Council, and it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome today the Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs and former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Spain, Arantxa González, the Professor of International Trade and Economic Development at the University of St. Gallen, creator of the Global Trade Alert Initiative, Simon Evenet, and Renata Amaral, professor at the American University in Washington, D.C. These bona fide experts in the subject of foreign trade were kind enough to accept our invitation to share with us on this occasion their comments and insights regarding the highly controversial issue of trade sanctions, the effects they have on the players in dispute, and the effectiveness of the measures imposed. Victor do Prado, Senior Fellow at CEBRI and former Director of Council and Trade Negotiations Committee at the WTO, shall serve as moderator of this distinguished panel to be conducted in English without simultaneous translation. Besides being a specialist himself, Victor, a lifelong friend and associate, has been a driving force behind CEBRI's International Trade and Global Economic Program, which I have the honor to coordinate. Now, the momentous subject matter of our event today is trade sanctions, effects, and effectiveness. Trade sanctions are commonly defined as commercial penalties imposed by one or more countries against one or more sovereign states. They generally include various forms of barriers to trade, such as high tariffs and quantitative restrictions, often in violation of multilaterally agreed obligations. Trade sanctions are not necessarily applied for economic reasons or because of economic circumstances. Their purpose, either domestic or international, is to accomplish foreign policy and or national security goals. They can be either selective or comprehensive and have been justified and used as an alternative means to military action. Nicholas Mulder, in his The Economic Weapon, The Rise of Sanctions as a Tool of Modern War, reminds us of the use of blockades during World War I and of the subsequent recourse to the embargo, i.e. the partial or complete prohibition of commerce and trade with a particular state or group of states. Of course, while blockades were or are often considered to be acts of war, embargoes are generally considered legal barriers to trade by limiting or banning exports or imports, creating quotas and so forth. But the efficacy of sanctions, be they commercial or financial, is debatable. Sanctions can have unintended consequences and unforeseen effects. Their effectiveness is also controversial, as their most frequent foreign policy objective, namely regime change, is hardly ever achieved. Allow me to conclude with the explanation given by Jeremy Greenstock, an eminent British retired diplomat, as to why sanctions were at his time imposed, even when they might be marginally effective. He suggested that sanctions were popular not because they were known to be effective, but because, and I quote, "there is nothing else to do between words and military action if you want to bring pressure upon a government." Over to you, Victor.
Thank you very much, José Alfredo. Thank you for your kind words. Thank you so much for this introduction, which I think inspires us all. I am not going to take more time, but just to thank the three guest speakers wholeheartedly. They're all experts in this issue and good friends. I will then just offer the floor to Arantxa Gonzalez, who I am sure will give us more food for thought. Arantxa, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being there.
Thank you, Victor. Thanks, José Alfredo, for this interaction, and thank you to CEBRI for organizing this conversation. This conversation is about sanctions, their pertinence, their legal basis, and their efficiency. But I want to take a little bit of altitude and maybe look at the backdrop where this discussion on sanctions is taking place. Because these are not normal times. And I think this is what we need to understand. We are living under an incredible geopolitical moment. Geopolitics are back with a lot of force, and with it, power as the structuring feature of international relations. Power has always been a feature of international relations, you will tell me, and I would agree with this. But what we are seeing now is power again is structuring the international relations among especially the major players. This is today one of the key features structuring the international order. This is what we have seen with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia as the last installment of this more geopolitical context. In this context, I think it's not fair, and again, in order to frame this conversation, to speak of the West and the rest. I think what we are to discuss at the backdrop against which to discuss this issue of sanctions is the division between those countries that are interested in and want an international order based on norms, rights, obligations, and institutions, and those that want to see an international order essentially driven by power relations. This is the dividing line today, and I wanted to bring this to the conversation because I think this is the context within which we have to analyze the issue of sanctions. This therefore is, again, the line is rules-based versus power-based. I think this is an important consideration for a country like Brazil that has always been a constructor of a multilateral system based on norms and institutions, because I think from where Brazil sits, from where Spain sits, if I look back at my own country, this is a very important insurance policy for its insertion into the international order. What we're seeing in this much more geopolitical context is obviously an increase in a strategic competition and also an increase in the use of economic coercion tools. We saw coercion tools used by China to limit access of Lithuanian products to its market. We saw coercion tools with withholding of gas exports by Russia to the European Union prior to the invasion of Ukraine. Before that, we saw the extensive use of economic coercion instruments by President Trump. Let's take as an example the measures taken against imports into the US of aluminum or steel imports on national security grounds, which in reality were, in a way, some sort of economic coercion instruments. These are a few examples. There are much more, and this is not the exclusive domain of one or two countries. It's becoming a wider feature of the international landscape, and I'm sure that we'll hear much more about that from Simon, so I will not dwell into that. I wanted, nevertheless, to point out the risks of this much more geopolitical environment for international trade. First is that geopolitics become the spread into the heart of international trade, that we've got international security concerns hollowing out the rules of international trade, the return of blocs. And with the return of blocs, obviously, the danger and the risks of fragmentation of the level playing field. And I would caution against this risk, given that the main feature of the international system we live in is one of interdependence. It's not one of dependence, it's not one of independence, it's one of interdependence. And ultimately, if we do not manage this interdependence, and managing it, harnessing it, is the challenge that we're facing today, what we will see is a reduction of growth, a reduction of innovation, and a reduction of prosperity. Global decoupling, which is what fragmentation will lead to, is going to make us all much poorer. And it is very difficult to imagine that in an environment characterized by fragmentation on international trade and on international economics, we would be able to see a lot of international cooperation on areas like climate change or financial stability, both of which are essential in order to resolve many of the challenges that today go beyond the national borders of a state. So the first risk I wanted to put on the table was one of the geopolitics spreading into the heart of international trade. The second is obviously with this economic coercion tools becoming more mainstream, risks for the WTO itself, the risk of weakening the set of international rules, the compact that the WTO agreements represent, which essentially is an insurance policy against the unilateral use of power, some sort of self-restraint, because one understands that this self-restraint is good for harnessing interdependence. The third risk that I see is a particular risk for those countries that are more dependent on the international stability, on international trade, on rules of the game, and we are seeing this today with the huge impact that the increase in prices of food, of fuel, and of fertilizers has on many of the world's poorest countries. So I wanted to put this because this is the backdrop against which we're going to be discussing sanctions. It's not in the abstract, but in a world that is much more driven by power politics. I will end up by not only describing the problems, but maybe hinting at where we need to find some sort of avenue for solutions that, in my view, leads to strengthening multilateral cooperation. I know when I say this, it's not very popular, but I'm not into some sort of popularity contest. I think we need to be lucid in what dangers we face, but also what avenues we have for addressing those dangers. And the dangers today of fragmentation, of decoupling, of increased poverty outlook is to work more on at a cooperative level. Members of the WTO are soon to face an international meeting. It will be the next ministerial conference in Geneva, and I do hope that they invest in strengthening this multilateral compact also as a means to demonstrate that there is some sort of stabilizer against all the geopolitical turbulences that we're seeing. With this, Victor, back to you, and obviously happy to engage in the conversation after we've listened to the other colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arantxa. Thanks for reminding us of the background and this useful differentiation that you make between rules-based and power-based. I think this resonates with many of us, and for pointing out the risks of this geopolitical environment. Now, Simon, you have written extensively and researched extensively on these risks. And on the economic side of the sanctions, I was just reading the other day the white paper you wrote for the World Economic Forum that refers to some of these issues that Arantxa is talking about, fragmentation, etc. So over to you, Simon, please, to expand on the economic side and on those risks. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor, and also thank you to CEBRI for this invitation. It's great to be back at another one of your events. Now, the salience of this issue, of course, is driven entirely by the armed conflict that we're seeing in Ukraine. And it is appropriate to see the sanctions and the economic impact in light of the previous literature. And here I think Jose Alfredo did a very nice job of articulating that literature. And the context of growing geopolitical rivalry mentioned by Arantxa is also something that I will draw in as well. So first, when we think about economic sanctions, when we think about trade sanctions, the purpose of them is typically fourfold, or there are four options. One is to deter bad behavior. A second is to change behavior of a foreign government. A third is to punish bad behavior. And a fourth is to undertake regime change. Now, when trade sanctions have been evaluated on these four metrics, as Jose Alfredo has argued, the literature is not very promising. I mean, it suggests that the failure rate is actually rather high. But as he noted, the sanctions happen anyway, and I will come to this point in one of the three big elements points I'll make later. So these are almost like a second best, third best reaction which governments have, even though they know that they're not particularly effective. But still, it's worth remembering that there are these four objectives. Now, linked to this is the sort of growing geopolitical rivalry which Arantxa raised. And as I think Mark Leonard has really nicely put it, we have seen a number of examples of countries weaponizing globalization in the past decade or so. And I think as we turned the century, we looked at globalization as creating opportunities for individuals, companies, societies. We never really thought of it as a weapon, but as I think experience has shown, some countries have decided to cut off the supply of raw materials or certain elements and items, and have tried to use this to punish countries. Others have used denial of access to their markets to try and punish foreign nations as well. And so I think it is an important part of the context now is that we have some governments who want to weaponize globalization. And that's when we come to think about the implications for the WTO is important, because the rules that we have on export restrictions and things like this are rather weak, and that might be something we need to rethink as well. Now, these two contextual points, I think, lead nicely to the three arguments I want to make. The first is that from an economics point of view only, the trade sanctions as currently designed against Russia are likely to have a limited effect, yet they're likely to stay in place. So, and I think this is now well understood, and it's worth understanding why, and I'll unpack that. The second is, if we're interested in isolating Russia over the medium to longer term, then we might want to look back at previous efforts to isolate renegade nations. And I'm going to draw from the example of apartheid era South Africa. The third, so the second message is let's learn from history. And I think there's an interesting historical lesson there. And then the third point I want to make is, and this links very nicely to Arantxa's theme on fragmentation, is that there are risks from this current sanctions episode with respect to Russia and Belarus. There are risks for the WTO, but I think they can be managed. And what I want to do is identify those risks so that we can put them on the table and realize them before we find ourselves walking into decisions with our eyes closed. So let's start with the first point. In terms of the economic impact of trade sanctions, it's useful to have a benchmark. Last year, someone did a very comprehensive job looking at dozens of sanctions episodes since World War II. And they found that the average impact on the average hit to the sanctioned nation's income or GDP of comprehensive sanctions, so this is trade sanctions, financial sanctions, military sanctions, is about 4% of GDP spread over 2 years. So that's one benchmark. So you can judge any new sanctions regime against 4% is one way of looking at it. The second benchmark, which might be relevant, is that when Russia joined the WTO, it was estimated by the World Bank that its GDP would rise by 3.3%. And that might be another way of judging the current sanctions regime, the extent to which Russia's benefits to the WTO have been denied. This, I think, is salient and relevant because the G7, in its pronouncements with the EU, actually mentioned the denial of these WTO benefits as an objective. So 3.3% might be another metric. With that in mind, I think it's useful to note that if you look at the different attempts to simulate the impact of sanctions, trade sanctions on Russia, you can find estimates in the range of about 1 to 2% of GDP. Myself and Mark Mundler looked at 3 different sanction scenarios where the EU and the US, so EU and the G7 threw the kitchen sink at Russia, including bans on importing energy. And the most you can get is about a 1.06% GDP loss over the medium term. The WTO has a secretariat has an analysis which gets to 2%. I'm not sure how they got to 2%, but they're credible people, and let's take that as given. But 2% is still far less than 3.3% or 4%. So this suggests then that the sanctions regimes as currently designed are probably not going to do much of an economic hit to Russia. Now, of course, I think the reality is that at the moment we haven't banned energy imports into the EU, which is really one of the big drivers of the numbers that I've just given you. And so in that sense, I suspect the actual impact over the medium term is going to be smaller if we have the current regimes. But these regimes could, of course, ratchet up, and they have been ratcheting up, and we must give full credit to that. Now, this is not to say, when I'm talking about these aggregate impacts, that there might not be sectors where there's big supply chain problems, and there might not be, there might be some very significant elements of the Russian population which are impacted. Imagine if you have Russians who are dependent upon foreign medicines, and if they don't get delivered, this, of course, could have some very serious social and health consequences. So I don't want to deny the impact of the sanctions. I just want to say that in line with the experience that Jose Alfredo mentioned, the current sanctions don't look like they're going to be particularly hard-hitting, at least in terms of economic impacts. This is the trade sanctions. The financial sanctions may be more hard-hitting, but even now there are people writing about how these sanctions are having less and less effect. And here I would refer you to the writings of the economists at the Institute for International Finance. So that's point one. Trade sanctions, again, are not much of an economic sledgehammer, but maybe we always knew that. Nevertheless, I think they will stay in place, largely because it seems incongruous to be criticizing Russia for its behavior and then trading with it at the same time, especially when that trade is being used to finance the military action. So I think on these grounds, the sanctions will remain. The second point I want to make is that if we are interested in isolating Russia and having a big impact on its living standards, then we probably need to learn from how South Africa was affected by sanctions. And South Africa was hit by a range of sanctions, trade, financial, by a subset of countries. Okay, perhaps fewer than the ones which are hitting Russia, but still a subset of countries. And what I think studies show in the South African case, which is interesting, is that when the sanctions hit, because the trade flows, the goods shipments to South Africa began to dry up, there was a corresponding knock-on effect, raising the cost of shipping to and from South Africa. And this secondary effect was actually really quite significant. So the best studies we have on this show the transportation costs, liner shipping costs to and from South Africa rose 50% during the sanctions regime. And they promptly fell at the end of the sanctions regime as well. Now, what does this mean for the current debate over Russia? It probably means that the choices of the world's shipping companies are extremely important. And if they decide to refrain from shipping goods in and out of Russia or do so at higher cost, then this can have a serious impact. And again, Mark Mundler and I simulated this And we reckon that if transportation costs in and out of Russia for products globally rise by about 5%, this will have more impact than all of the sanctions that the trade sanctions that the G7 and the EU have had. So I think the second big point to take away is that the private sector, especially the shipping companies, can play a very significant role here in isolating the Russian economy. And of course, to the extent that they do this, they disadvantage Russia's trade with everyone. The problem with the trade sanctions by the G7 and the EU is that only 40 countries are implementing them, and those 40 countries are only responsible for half of Russia's exports, not all of Russia's exports. And so that's the big difference between the two. So there is a way to go in terms of isolating the Russian economy if we want to. And in this regard, then it was a little bit disappointing that some EU member states could not sign up to a shipping ban. I think it was last week. And this is an area where the EU could do a little bit more. The third big point I want to make is on the issue of fragmentation. There are two big decisions which will probably have to be taken by governments going forward, and not just the ones involved in the armed conflict. And these are ones relating to the trading system. As we know, there are sanctions on shipping goods to Russia, or bans on shipping goods to Russia. Someone will inevitably break those sanctions, okay? And we have seen this before. In the 2014 sanctions on Russia for annexing Crimea, we suddenly started seeing in the trade data Belarus shipping fish to Russia, which had never happened before. Belarus is a landlocked country, and obviously someone had been shipping the fish to Belarus, and then it was being transshipped on. So we will get someone breaking the rules. The question is which countries, which firms ship those goods, and whether the firms or their governments get blamed. And you can imagine a scenario in which a Chinese state-owned shipping company is found to have shipped products which have been banned to Russia. And then the question is, do we blame the shipping company, or do we blame the Chinese government? Or rather, does Europe and the United States, or the G7 and the EU, blame the Chinese government or the shipping company concerned? And you can, that I imagine will be a very important fork in the road. And I think if there is really unless there is a smoking gun, we should probably stick to the precedent of blaming the company that ships the goods, not the government's concern. But in this geopolitical environment, who knows how that debate could go. So that's risk number one. Risk number two is broader, and this builds on something which Arantxa said. We are seeing a number of countries articulate that access to their market should be conditioned more strictly on what they view as good behavior. Now, we've always had rules linking market access to good behavior when you think about GSP regimes. This is there. But some governments now want to go much further and argue that the best access to their market should only be given to to other countries that have the same governance arrangements, both political and economic. And so you have seen people in the United States, you've seen the British foreign minister explicitly arguing for essentially a redesigning of the trading system, essentially one which, they won't put it like this, but Arantxa did, and she's right to do it. It is right to say that they want to create blocks where we will have trade only between democracies who are peaceful. Okay, this move could be extremely damaging. Now, there is a variant of this scenario where there's not much damage is done, and that's where the democracies, the peaceful democracies, all liberalize trade amongst themselves and create some type of trading zone. Quite frankly, when one looks at the willingness of the polities in North America and Western Europe to liberalize, one doesn't see much of it. So the other way you can create a block is by raising barriers against everyone else and essentially denying MFN rights to countries which do not have the same political and economic governance arrangements. Now, the proponents of blocks have not been explicit about this yet, but this is where the logic goes. And I think this is a world which is extremely worrying for all the reasons that Arantxa described. And so that, I think, is the fear. I think those of us who are defenders of the trading system, and I hope we can still count our Brazilian friends in that group, should be very alert about this argument that we should condition market access and terms of and the benefits of the trading system on similar governance arrangements. And this sounds very, how can I put it? It sounds very polite, but it actually has some very, very serious implications. This is one thing we need to be alert for. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. And rest assured, I think at least in José Alfredo and myself and many people in CEBRI, we are staunch defenders of the multilateral trading system. And I think we do need to see the slippery slope of some of these risks that you're mentioning. These are very tricky situations. So thank you very much for that. Thank you also for reminding us of the shipping costs and how effective that can be. That came out as a surprise to me. Thank you very much for this. Renata, now you are sitting in Washington and observing this from not the European viewpost, but rather from an American viewpost. Of course, as a Brazilian, you're probably thinking about Brazil as well, our country, and how it fares in this world. So over to you, please, Renata, to give us your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. I was almost asking you to forget about me because I wanted to keep listening to Simon and to Arantxa, but I'm a big fan of all of you, you know that. So thank you very much, Ambassador Graça Lima, Victor, CEBRI, for the invitation. I'm very honored to be sitting here in this panel with you. So I will provide a little bit of perspective on the US sanctions. It's the country that's posing most of the more robust sanctions. And then I'll dive into Brazil and possible impacts to Brazil. So the US sanctions, they are not new. They have been around in the US for several years. They have gained more attention recently because of course, the unprecedented wave of sanctions in response to the Russian invasion in Ukraine. But US sanctions have been used by the US to further foreign policy and national security interests for many years. Economic sanctions have become a central element of US national security doctrine for the past years. So the US government has taken advantage of US centrality in the international financial trade systems to restrict funding flows from external enemies such as Al-Qaeda, North Korea, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and now more robustly against Russia. The US has structural advantage that potentiates the use of financial and trade sanctions, right? They are the largest importing country in the world, and having access to the US market is critical for most global companies. So dependence is heightened by the fact that the dollar is the global reserve currency, which allows the US government to restrict access to the main means used in international transactions and in raising foreign funds. So the reason why sanctions have such an impact in the global business community is because the US dollar is such a used currency in international trade, and that gives the US a jurisdictional basis to restrict transactions. So we can say that transactions are rooted in the continuous predominancy of the US dollar, and that the power of the country, that results in the power of the country on business. It gives US sanctions a broad reach, which gives the US ability to use it as a tool and has been using it for many years. So this is why US sanctions have such a bite. Whether the sanctions are effective and efficient is in the current scenario is the topic of our discussion. Simon already mentioned, and he has been writing a lot on this issue for the past weeks. Sanctions have very limited effects if we think about their objective at the end of the day, maybe to make Russia change the course of its plans. For this reason, probably the sanctions are not really being so efficient. But before we talk about efficiency and efficacy of the sanctions, and I guess we can discuss more about that during the questions, I wanted to outline what are the general current framework of the US sanctions. So there are basically two types of sanctions being applied by the US. The primary sanctions, which occur when the US has jurisdiction over the person or company, and secondary sanctions, which apply even if there is no US jurisdiction. Penalties for violating primary sanctions can be fines or imprisonment, and penalties for secondary sanctions come in a variety of ways, such as controls on US exports and imports, travel bans, asset freezes, removal from the US financial system, and other restrictions on the economic activity of sanctioned countries and entities. The US Constitution gives the US president vast authority in foreign policy and in the direction of the sanctions and extent of the sanctions. And the implementation of sanctions programs is the responsibility of specialized agencies here in the US, especially the famous OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which is linked to the US Department of Treasury. And OFAC regularly updates also a famous list, the SDN list, Special Designated Nationals and Blocked Persons list, which identifies foreign individuals and entities involved in activities contrary to US sanctions programs. So the current US sanctions program against Russia consists in hundreds of Russian entities and persons listed as SDN, as especially designated nationals, as well as sectoral sanctions applicable on specific sectors of the Russian economy, such as financial, defense, and energy sectors. There are also export controls for certain goods, such as for oil or gas exploitation in Russian offshores. So here's a little bit of a summary of US sanctions against Russia and Belarus, which have been expanded as the situation has evolved since February. So President Putin, close officials and family members are sanctioned, including his prime minister, his spokesperson, Peskov, hundreds of Duma members, oligarchs, business people, Russian banks, and financial institutions. In February, there were 2 executive orders that blocked investment, trade, and financing in Donetsk and Luhansk, and that cut off financing from the West by prohibiting transactions involving Russian Central Bank, National Wealth Fund, and Ministry of Finance. In March, executive orders prohibited U.S. imports of crude oil, petroleum products, gas, coal, and coal products, new investments by U.S. persons across the Russian energy sector, U.S. persons from financing and facilitating transactions by foreign persons involving such new investment. Also in March, there were U.S. ban imports on fish, seafood, alcoholic beverage, non-industrial diamonds, U.S. exports prohibition of certain luxury goods, prohibition of U.S. banknotes to Russian and any person in Russia, as well as any person from approving, financing, and facilitating transaction by a foreign person involving U.S. banknotes. Also in March, and Simon briefly mentioned the G7, in a coordinated effort of G7, the US and the EU and the UK sanctioned more than 400 individuals and organizations in Russia, including 48 defense companies and its supply chain in more than 300 Duma members. Export control restrictions were revamped since February. Simon mentioned a little bit about the rules that we have currently for export controls, which are not that strong, and here in the US and other countries we have been following, they were really revamped since February. And also in February, just to finalize the US sanctions applied in April, there was a House proposed bill that was signed by President Biden to suspend normal trade relations with Russia and Belarus, and then we come to the WTO, right? Which in fact disrupts normal trade relations with the Russian Federation and the Republic of Belarus, and aims to further leverage trade sanctions and human rights. Under this law, as of April 9, 2022, imports originating in both countries are ineligible for the most favored nation MFN tariff rates that the US currently applies to imports from all WTO member countries. So instead, imports originating in Russia and Belarus will be subject to the rates which average approximately to 32.3% versus an average of MFN tariff of 3.3%. And the President's authority to proclaim such tariff increases expires in January next year, 2024. So just why is this all important to Brazil, right? Brazil is not applying sanctions, but Brazil has been affected by the sanctions indirectly. And also the first topic that comes to mind is the fertilizers issues when we talk about Brazil, right? The Ukraine-Russia crisis exposed the high dependence of the Brazilian agricultural sector on the import of fertilizers. Brazil consumes an average of 40 million tons of fertilizers yearly and imports almost 90% of the fertilizers consumed in the country. Russia alone is responsible for approximately 24% of the total imports by Brazilian agricultural producers. So crops of soybean, corn, sugarcane, coffee, and cotton might be severely affected. The huge dependence on imports of fertilizers by Brazil has been growing over time as the demand of agricultural inputs increase. So considering the consumption data of the country for the past years from 2018 to 2021, the imports increased from 77 to 85%, while domestic production decreased from 23 to 15% over the same period. And it's estimated that soybean is the crop that most consumer fertilizers in Brazil might be the most affected one, reaching 35% of the total consumption of the country. I was actually reading a news this morning, Simon, talking about shipment and how Brazilian exports to Russia were affected by the shipment because Brazil uses foreign companies, right, to ship its products to Russia. So Brazil was hit hard by the shipment problem in the past month. And just to finalize, how US sanctions can impact companies in Brazil. Although there is no impediment in Brazilian law for a Brazilian company to transact with a Russian company, US sanctions might apply. US law, executive orders, and OFAC normative instructions must be considered together in the interpretation of the sanctions program of the US. So, for example, if a person or Brazilian company assists or provides financial, material, technological, or goods and services to persons included in the SDN list of the US, they are also subject to being included on the SDN list or even other sanctions. So this illustrates the extraterritorial effects of US secondary sanctions, right? Once listed in the SDN list, a foreign individual or company might have their assets and property blocked or frozen, as well as prohibited from doing business with any company or individual subject to US jurisdiction. Victor, I think I will stop here. It's a lot of information, so we can dive in during the questions and explore more each of the items and information I brought here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this, Renata. Well, I guess we now have a pretty complete picture of the sanctions. I mean, a lot has been said about the effects. A lot has been said about the effectiveness. And I mean, at least I'm already wiser after having heard Arantxa, Simon, and Renata than I was before. So thank you all very much, and Jose Alfredo as well. Now we have a bit of time for Q&A, and we do have two questions and one comment from the public. I will read the two questions first. One is from Sunitha Raju, who's a professor in India, and she says, the current geopolitics leading to weaponizing fragmentation of globalization is a very valid pointer made by the panelists. And her question is, could these deter other countries who might have tried such escapades in the recent past, for instance, China and Taiwan? China's aggression of other countries is well known, so will the current sanctions make China think before undertaking any such aggressions? So anyone who might want to reply to this, but I think it's a challenging question. Now we have another question from Enrique Reginski. Enrique is a good friend. He's a board member of CEBRI. He was a senior vice president for external relations of Embraer. So those of us who were in previous lives involved in some WTO disputes know Enrique quite well. And he asks, do you agree, and I guess I'm looking at you, Simon, do you agree that the cost of isolating Russia, despite all the responsibility about the tragedies derived from initiating this war, can be even more dramatic for the rest of the world, or for the world, and especially for Ukrainians? Also a very challenging question. So over to you. Maybe Arantxa, any comments you might have on the larger China issue, and then Simon, but that is just a suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. My take on China, and it doesn't engage anyone except me, is that China is a rather rational player. And China will be playing for China. So what we are likely to see with China is China respecting sanctions, because China would not want, and Chinese companies would not want to be hit by the secondary effect of American sanctions, that, as we know, American sanctions are not only against Russian assets or Russian actors, but also against anyone that helps Russian assets or Russian actors circumvent the sanctions against them. So my sense is that a rational China will not engage into circumventing the sanctions or helping Russia circumvent the sanctions. By the same token, and given that playing a bit the anti-Western card gets a bit of support in China, I'm not sure that we will see China playing any mediation role in the conflict on Ukraine. I don't think that we are likely to see that. And by the same token, I am not convinced that China will initiate any adventure on Taiwan, at least unless it is 100% sure to win that battle. So my sense is that on the Chinese side, what we are to expect is a very rational China making very rational decisions. Now, we all know that sometimes rationality is clouded in specific moments. So, I mean, God knows, I'm not trying to read into a crystal ball, but what we are seeing up until now is Chinese companies, and we've seen a couple of examples recently, not wanting to come in support of Russian companies in the technology sector by fear of secondary sanctions. And certainly we are not seeing, despite a lot of pronouncements, we are not seeing much action on the Chinese side in support of Russia.
Thanks, Arantxa. That's pretty clear. Simon, any comments on the effects, sort of the wider effects on the world, which I think are very, very well known. So your take on those. Thanks.
So I think we have to separate out perhaps two issues here. First, if you look narrowly just at the trade sanctions which have been imposed and the estimates about who gets hit the most from them, it would be hard to make the case that hitting Russia with sanctions hits other countries more in terms of GDP effect. I don't think I've seen that in the studies that I've read. Okay, but, and I think this is where the questioner might be coming in, there are other knock-on effects from this armed conflict, which are having an effect on some countries, especially some developing countries, which ought to be very serious, ought to be a very serious concern. And of course, this is principally in the area of food and fertilizer, where we are seeing first a loss of supply in Ukraine, also a banning of exports by a number of countries, not starting with Russia, but including Russia, let's put it that way. The knock-on effect of these measures is still unfolding. The impacts on the price of food are there. We see them in the data. Yesterday, we saw the price of wheat rise by nearly 6% after the announcement by India that they would ban exports. So if the questioner, Enrique, was alluding to those types of knock-on effects, then indeed you could argue that these effects are very, very serious for especially food-dependent importing countries. And so you could see that the broader effects are for some countries perhaps worse than what Russia is going through. So in that way, I can understand where perhaps Enrique is coming from. But it would be by adding in the food and fertilizer dimension, which is formally different from the trade sanctions dimension.
Thank you very much, Simon. There's an interesting question from Jorge Riaboy, who's an old friend. Jorge was in Geneva in the Argentinian mission some time ago. Good to see that Jorge is also participating. And he says, perhaps I've missed the point, but I did not see any reference about how to introduce the role of institutional WTO enforcement capacity to these kinds of trade policy, quote unquote, actions. I think what Jorge says is, can the WTO enforce anything at this moment regarding the sanctions, if I understand Jorge's question well. Maybe I'll ask you to comment, Renata, to comment on this one. WTO enforcement these days is a tricky one, isn't it?
It is a tricky one. I have read also a lot of, in the beginning of when sanctions were started to be imposed and countries, WTO members were informing the organization they were applying, they were excluding Russia, and Belarus is not a member, but Russia from the MFN treatment. How this could be a violation of WTO norms as well, right? And maybe the escape clause would be Article 21. We have talked about this before with national security exemption, but the WTO itself cannot force. There are no rules to expose Russia from the system, and I think that's not smart at all, not to have Russia anymore in the system. So I think that's not an option. And enforcing unilateral measures, I think that's not a role of the WTO itself, right? We can discuss that in dispute settlement, for example, but the institution, the secretariat, the WTO itself cannot do much, right? Can only be informed about the measures being applied by WTO members. But if we want to contest and enforce those measures, we probably would go to the dispute settlement system. And that's another topic of conversation for another webinar, because then we have another crisis to talk about. But I think there is not that the organization itself can do, right, to enforce those measures.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And just yesterday, or was it the day before, we were talking also with José Alfredo about the relationship between these types of sanctions or embargoes in the history of the WTO. And much as there were talks in the 70s and 80s about the embargoes, for example, Cuba never came to dispute settlement in the WTO to question the US embargo. I mean, there was, of course, the Havana Club, and that was a EU-US dispute with Cuba as a third party. But it was not in and of itself a questioning of the embargo. Same with the trade measures that some Arab countries apply on Israel. Somehow we had this feeling that these measures, that these were political issues much beyond the remit of the WTO. But then things get confusing once, as Arantxa recalled, President Trump uses Article 21 national security on steel and aluminum, right? And makes all of this much, banalized in a way which is incredibly risky. And now we do have some disputes on those issues. There's a couple of comments from Milton Vimelo. They're not questions, they're just a couple of comments I'd like to share with you. One comment, he says, in my opinion, trade and financial sections work very well regarding small business. When it is a big operation, there will be inevitable bypasses to avoid all kinds of sanctions. And the result is an increase in the cost of trade. Another comment that he makes is that the US sanctions against other countries already affect Brazil. Brazil cannot trade with Iran, for example, and this has been an issue hotly discussed in other parts of the world. In the EU, trade relations between the EU and Iran have been an interesting subject as well. Not sure there are comments or questions from our panelists now. One thing that I would like to see any comments on is, where do we go from here? Simon, you say that the sanctions are likely to remain. So are we in a scenario where we get a sort of an extended conflict and an extended sanctions with the effects and negative effects, but not a lot of effectiveness? Is that the summary?
It doesn't, I mean, it could be, but it doesn't have to be, right? Imagine you could envisage a scenario where there is some type of ceasefire agreed in Ukraine, where that ceasefire holds and is respected by all the parties, and where there is presumably some type of discussion about how to rebuild Ukraine and who pays for it. And assuming that Russia stays on the right side of the line through all of that, then maybe down the road Russia gets rehabilitated within the WTO. So there's a path back to where we were before the 24th of February. I'm not sure how likely that is, but we can't exclude it automatically. I mean, after all, I think most people do want to see some type of resolution and peace in the Ukraine, and people have talked about, the end. There will ultimately probably have to be some type of accommodation if there isn't an outright victory on either side. So you can tell a story like this. I think until we get to that point, Russia will remain shunned, and this has implications not just for the how long the sanctions last, but whether they are ratcheted up. But it also has implications for the work within the WTO. There may be some of the negotiations, the JSIs in particular, where it's hard to make progress if the West in particular doesn't want to talk to Russia. So if that split, I know that Arantxa doesn't like that split, but if that split persists, then you could imagine that there could be problems for the operation of the WTO. But again, likewise, maybe some type of informal accommodation can be reached with the Russian delegation, and there's no reason to suppose that couldn't happen either. So I don't think doom and gloom is necessarily the outcome here. And of course, we have to hope that sounder counsels will prevail eventually in Moscow and elsewhere, which takes us in the right direction. So I wouldn't want your webinar participants to think that it's all downhill from here. But the important point is there are still important choices for governments to make, and we should be encouraging governments to do the responsible thing.
Thank you very much. Agree with you. Yeah, I was going to ask Arantxa, do you have any further comments on this? Thank you.
Yeah, I think there is one aspect that we may have overlooked a little bit, which is sanctions in its broadest appreciation has not just been an action by governments. What we've also seen is lots of quote unquote sanctions being taken by the business community, freezing investments in Russia, pulling out of Russia, shedding employment in Russia, abandoning Russia as a market. We've seen sanctions, quote unquote, adopted by the sports community, by academic communities, by arts communities. So I think what we've seen, in addition to the trade sanctions taken by states proper and many other restrictive measures or sanctions, not just trade related, by freezing the assets of the central bank, which was an unprecedented move. There is lots of unprecedented moves in this case, probably because this is a bit of an unprecedented situation. And I think it will take time to quote unquote normalize, given the gravity of what has happened. So I think that the digestion will be long and the digestion will be complicated, given the implications, but also given what triggered these sanctions in the first place. Let's never forget that what triggered this in the first place was the invasion of one country, of another country, violating its borders, violating the sovereign borders of another member state, which is, again, pretty unprecedented.
Yeah, thank you, Arantxa, for reminding us of these two things. And yes, anybody reading the newspapers today saw the actions of a large fast food chain pulling out of Russia, and at the beginning of the conflict, how business was actually taking the lead even before governments in applying some measures against Russia. Yes, Renata, would you like to come in?
May I make a question to Simon and Arantxa, since you're more frequently in Geneva? What do you think could be the practical effects or concrete effects of all this situation next month during the ministerial? Do you see any coming for any possible results or no results of the ministerial conference? Do you think that this situation, Russia-Ukraine situation, will concretely impact or could impact any sort of decision next month? Simon?
Well, I guess the safe answer is to say it's a complicating factor in a situation that was already pretty complicated to start with. I think let's try and unpack this for you more systematically. There will be presentational questions. Will the Russian minister come? Will there be photos with the Russian minister? Will my minister, if it's a non-Russian minister, be seen with the Russian minister? Those types, there will be a whole set of questions about that. Then I guess there's going to be questions about who will make statements at key points in the ministerial, and whether or not other countries will walk out if a Russian representative speaks. And these are all things which, in his old job, I'm sure Victor would have sketched out all the possible scenarios going on there. In terms of getting stuff done, from what I've heard, the JSI talks on e-commerce have been adversely affected because of Russia, because Russia is a party to them, and then there doesn't seem to be a willingness to talk. I know less about the fishery subsidies suggestion. It seems excuse me, that Santiago wills and is going ahead, but then Santiago always goes ahead. So he's a very positive momentum machine. So I'm sure he'd be trying to find a way around this. But still, I mean, Russia's a major player in that negotiation, and it would have to be dealt with. So I can't see how this is good news at all. And I think it just introduces a geopolitical element, which is a bit hard to negotiate around. Some are, lots of trade issues you can trade things off, but this one doesn't seem to be, doesn't fall into that category. So I think it's very unhelpful.
Yeah. Any comments on this one, Arantxa?
I think I very much agree with what Simon has said. But I mean, I think there is a wider consideration, obviously, is for every member of the WTO is whether or not an unsuccessful ministerial makes it easier or makes it more complicated and makes it more damaging and makes it more negative. And I hope the latter prevails because, again, I do think that no result in this ministerial would again be a signal that of fragmentation, of division, of incapacity to deal with issues that are of a systemic nature. And if it doesn't work in the international trade scene, what will happen on the biodiversity scene, which is a little bit later down the road? What will happen on the climate scene, that is a little bit later than later? So I think I do hope that those who care about the multilateral cooperation, and I do, and I'm sure that this is the case of Brazil, would put also a bit of efforts into making sure the negotiations, the ministerial leads to some sort of result.
Thank you very much, Arantxa. I think we're all in agreement with that. Now we're coming to the end of today's session. Let me just ask Ambassador Graça Lima if he has any final words or comments at this moment. Ms. Alfredo.
Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you, Victor. I just want to say how pleased I am with having had this debate moderated by you and with the speakers giving us, such as you said, such a complete picture of what we have in front of us today in terms of sanctions, trade sanctions, and their consequences and their effectiveness. At one point I was going to ask a question which may have already been answered by at one point or another. I remember that at the most critical stage of the pandemics, one would argue that the world would change in many ways, that the globalization was seriously compromised, and that we have a new international order, a revival of the Cold War. So many arguments in favor of change and the world embarking on a journey that was not optimistic at all. But and as we approach a moment when we can see in the near future or in not so distant future peace in Ukraine, or at least a ceasefire, as Simon mentioned. The question would be whether the speakers, the panelists, think that when the Ukrainian war is over, that we will revert to a business as usual situation, or will we be seeing the war as an incentive to violate the rules and pressurize WTO even more, have the kind of world that was foreseen by those who believe that pandemics would have a tremendous impact on life as we have today.
I would not venture to comment. It is very thought-provoking, indeed, and we didn't speak about the political effect or implications of the conflict in Ukraine. That was not the objective today, but there's surely interesting political developments, especially transatlantic, because of this conflict. But whether the world will, how it will be shaped after the war is indeed a very thought-provoking question. Perhaps we should have another seminar about this one. But let me just ask Renata, Simon, Arantxa if they want to make any final comments.
I'll be very fast. I'm afraid, Ambassador, that first this will not end so soon, the war, and maybe it, as we had with the pandemic, we didn't end the pandemic, and then we have a war, and maybe we're gonna have other a little pessimistic events. Hopefully not, but. Here in the US, for example, even before the pandemic, we were following closely China-US trade war. So I think we're going to have to be very creative and innovative, and we need new people, new thinkers to think about creative solutions. In an interview I made with a former supervisor, Peter van den Bosch, for my trade summer program here 2 years ago, he mentioned that maybe we are all part of a sinking boat, and we really need believers. We need new people, and I totally agree. So I believe in multilateral cooperation is the answer, as Arantxa mentioned several times. This is the answer. I don't know what format and what changes we need for this to work. But I really think we need believers, and we need creative solutions for the future, for the short-term future, actually, not so long-term, but short-term.
Well, I guess that's a good call. I think we're all believers here, and unless there are any further comments or questions, let me, on my part, thank Arantxa, Simon, Renata for your participation. It's been a great discussion. Thank you very much for taking your time and for bringing your intelligence and your perspectives to the discussion today. So, José Alfredo, your final word.
No final words. Just to thanks again to all. You are always welcome. We can accompany the events and sometime get you on board again for a new conversation.
Thank you very much, and let me say a word of thanks for José Pio, our chair, for being there, and for the whole. Thank you to the whole team in Rio and in São Paulo for supporting us today. So thank you all very much, and see you soon. Thank you.